Unexpected Guardian, a new exhibit for the Lakeside Museum. No one guessed it would turn out like this. Kayla peeked around the doorframe into the curator's office to see Dr. Renner sitting at his computer looking over the upcoming fall exhibits for the Lakeside Museum. She knocked on the open door, catching his attention. Her bubbly good nature was why she'd been hired recently as a tour guide. All the reviews she received were the highest they'd ever seen. Her smile was contagious, and the public adored her. "You have something to tell me?" he asked, not bothering to hide his responding smile. "The new exhibit is here," she chuckled. "I have to admit, the thought of scarecrows creeps me out." "It's one of our fall seasonal exhibits," he replied, standing. "Would you care to inspect the delivery with me?" "I guess, Dr. Renner," she said, her smile faltering slightly, but only for a moment. "I suppose I'd better get used to them sooner rather than later." "We're a small museum here," he said. "You can call me Dwight behind the scenes. Everyone else does." "I'll try to remember," she said, but he had a feeling it would take a while for her to feel comfortable with it. "Hold my calls, Laura," he called to his secretary as he headed to receiving, with Kayla following behind, reluctantly. Swiping his card to unlock the door, he immediately went to the receiving door so that he could go to the dock to direct the deliveryman. Dwight opened and inspected each crate while Kayla stood back several feet and took notes, marking items off the list along with their condition. He smiled to himself as he saw her shudder as they came to a peculiar piece. This scarecrow actually began creeping out Dwight. Its head was a sack of old-looking material with a truly scary face painted on it. Its clothes were wind-torn and frayed. Straw filled the red flannel shirt and tan pants. Crude hands were made as mittens from the same material as the head. They soon finished and locked the doors behind them as they returned to their normal duties. As soon as the door locked shut, the scarecrow's head moved slightly, turning toward the door. Dwight gave Kayla a brief history lesson on the way back to the offices about scarecrows. She listened even though she didn't really want to know this information. Back in ancient Egypt, they were first used along the Nile with nets to catch the birds eating their grains, he told her. They were also used in Greece, Britain, and even Japan. "I think my dislike of them is from the character in the comics," she admitted. "Scared me to death as a kid." "I can understand," he chuckled. "Is this a deal breaker for the job?" "No," she mumbled. "It's time I got over this. I can at least deal with it for the tours." "Thank you," he smiled. "I appreciate it." It was several days later when Kayla popped her head in the doorway of Dwight's office. Her eyes were wide as she tried to talk, but couldn't get her words out. Dwight tilted his head and motioned her inside. She sat in the chair opposite him. "Take a deep breath," he told her calmly. "What happened?" She let out a shaky breath. "It's Straussy again," she admitted. "Every day, they're finding it in a different place in a different pose. It's so creepy." "Did you check with security?" he asked. She nodded. "It's more of the same," she reported, shuddering. "Monitors go to static for a split moment and then it shows up in a different location. Nothing else is moved or taken." "How could that happen?" "It's a funny prank, I have to admit," Dwight chuckled. "Very inventive." "I don't agree," she muttered. "A prank or funny?" he asked, smiling, as he glanced her way. "Both," she exclaimed, and then looked down embarrassed. He chuckled silently. "Let's see what he's gotten himself into today," Dwight suggested. "No, thanks," she said, shaking her head. "Fill me in later?" "Sure," he chuckled, standing up and walking toward the main exhibits. Was it a prank, or is it something more, he thought to himself. As Dwight entered the small animal section of the museum, he couldn't help chuckling as he saw Straussy this time. They'd come up with the name Straussy because he was so funny and showing up everywhere all the time. It was sitting on the floor with its straw legs crisscrossed directly in front of the cubs playing in the tiger exhibit scene. Whoever was doing this had a hilarious sense of humor. As he laughed, shaking his head, he scanned the area for any clues. As usual, there weren't any. He ended up with more questions than before and no answers in sight. Dwight cell-dinged and his breath caught in his throat. Their new exhibits were delivered earlier than expected. Quickly, he went to the receiving area to check in and sign for the transfer of responsibility. This exhibit was going to help make a name for their museum. It was was a set of 4 pieces of Egyptian jewelry from the days of the ancient pharaohs. Looking at the pieces, he decided to make a few calls to assign this important exhibit its own security. He also came up with several additional measures to keep them safe, but those he decided to keep to himself. Several days later, Dwight was seeing himself on the news and in several newspaper articles. It was great publicity for the museum, but he felt a little outside of his comfort zone with all the attention. Henrietta, the receptionist, was being kept on her toes, fielding calls regarding the exhibit and jewels. Kayla's tours were booked solid for weeks. Guards were now on duty 24/7, and it was worth it. Memberships and admissions have tripled. Dwight was thrilled with how everything was working out. Several institutions and patrons of the arts have reached out for collaborations or exhibitions. As long as nothing went wrong, Lakeside Museum would never have to worry about going under, and they could focus on some much-needed repairs and renovations. Tomorrow was the opening day of the Pharaoh's jewelry set. Dwight was excited, yet so nervous that he couldn't even eat. He had a feeling he wouldn't be able to sleep that night, so he was in his office until after midnight attempting to do paperwork, but he fell asleep on his desk. It was almost 2 a.m. when the guards for the Pharaoh's jewelry set were alternating their breaks. Diagonally from it, the Halloween exhibit actually had the scarecrow in the middle of where he was actually supposed to be. It was facing the direction of the new exhibit, oddly enough. When the second guard went around the corner toward the door to the behind-the-scenes area, a loud thud was heard. "George?" called out the remaining guard. Silence greeted him. Without hesitation, he hit the alarm button, causing a shrill sound and flashing lights to flood the entire building. Dwight was jarred awake by the noise and raced out of his office. As he ran around the corner to the Egyptian display, he skidded to a sudden halt. One of the guards was on the floor unconscious. Movement caught his eye across the room. His eyes widened in pure shock, and his jaw hung open. Straw was flying around the room as Strozzi bounced back and forth between the 2 armed men dressed in all black. Loud thuds and whacks echoed through the corridors as the scarecrow used the pole he'd been exhibited on as a weapon. One thief fired his gun, but to no use. It simply went through his straw body and embedded itself into the wall behind it. Within moments, both thieves were on the floor, writhing and groaning in pain. In one last swift movement, Strozzi hit both of them in their heads, immediately knocking them out. It stood perfectly still as Dwight approached the fallen guard. He was alive, thank goodness. He stood and took several steps towards Strozzi. Most of the straw that had covered the floor from the battle began to float up into the air and returned to fluff out his body once again. Dwight let out a shaky breath, unsure of what to do. In a blink, the scarecrow moved and was now inches from him. As the wailing of sirens were heard, the pole was thrust into Dwight's hands. Surprise flowed through him. "I understand," he said. Strozzi bowed his head briefly. Dwight did the same as he watched the unexpected guardian return to its own area, completely still once again. From around the far corner, the second guard stumbled out into the open. He was holding the back of his head and had blood on the side of his face. "Are you all right?" Dwight asked him. He held onto the wall as he slid into a seated position on the floor. "I'll be okay," he muttered. As police arrived at the scene, they called for an ambulance for the guards as well as the thieves. Dwight had to give a report of what happened. He told the truth with one exception. He left Strozzi out of it, and he was credited for taking down the robbers himself. He had no choice unless he wanted to sound insane. He wondered what the thieves would say when questioned. He'd love to listen in on that. Once the replacement guards arrived, Dwight stopped for a moment at the fall exhibit and gave a small salute, smiling. He swore he saw the corners of the cloth move, giving the impression of a slight smile. Smiling in return, he headed home. Dwight ended up making Strozzi a permanent museum fixture. Orders were given that he wasn't to be put in storage, and that it was a game of sorts for him to show up in different exhibits. Strozzi now had a permanent smile and became the mascot of sorts for the museum. No one was ever able to break into the museum again. Its unexpected guardian made sure of that. Like and subscribe to hear more stories like this. Here's another cool story to listen to next.